On the eve of the 20th century, the Swedish scientist and later Nobel Prize winner Svante Arrhenius developed the world's first climate model. He deduced, without the help of calculators, computers, or ChatGPT, that if the amount of carbon dioxide in the air were to double, global surface temperatures would increase between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. That's scarily close to the 2.5 to 4 degree impact predicted by the much more advanced models of today. Arrhenius thought that this carbon dioxide-fueled future he conjured would be delightful. Our descendants, he predicted, would live happier lives under a warmer sky. We may laugh now at Arrhenius' vision of the future, which he saw through rose-tinted sunglasses, but one can forgive a Swede for romanticizing a warmer world. Besides, the prospect was distant. He reckoned it would take humanity 3,000 years to double the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Cut to 130 years later, we're set to reach that doubling threshold within decades, and the results are apt to be disastrous, especially in South Africa, because Southern Africa has been identified as a climate change hotspot, meaning a region where the impacts of climate change are expected to be especially bad. This stems from the region's subtropical climate, which is already warm and dry, and under climate change, it's expected to become drastically warmer and drier. This isn't fair, of course, because one of the tragedies of climate change is that the countries that are going to be most affected by it were not the ones to benefit from the industrialization that caused it. And climate change isn't the problem of future generations, it's already happening. We only need to look around ourselves over the last few years to see evidence of it everywhere. And the experts say things are only going to accelerate from here. This picture is depressing, but being in the business of risk, we have to confront it. Yet, still, when I speak to fellow actuaries and other insurance professionals about climate change and the catastrophic risks it presents, I'm still often met with a response of "so what?", especially from those in the life and health insurance sector. I can understand why insurers may be dragging their heels to an extent. The facts are scary, almost too scary to contemplate. Climate change is unknown, it's complex, there are hundreds of conflicting views to balance and consider. It's daunting, it's overwhelming, and it's difficult to know where to start. So there may be an element of denial. The thing about denial, though, is that while the human brain is very good at using it as a mechanism to protect itself from realities that are uncomfortable or induce anxiety, the human body is less well equipped to defend itself from the realities of a hotter future. A reality that's going to come with far-reaching, unpleasant, and diverse impacts on our mental, physical, and financial well-being. The ethical concept of value pluralism goes some way to explain why climate change is so difficult to action. Value pluralism is the idea that there may be several values which are all correct, yet in conflict with one another, and there may also be no objective ordering of these ideas in terms of importance. So some examples when it comes to insurance and climate change is the conflict between insurers' various stakeholders. So shareholders may want decisions that maximize profits, policyholders or members may want decisions that are good for their own pockets or good for the environment. Intergenerational conflict is an example would be, why should I sacrifice now for the benefit of future generations? And then there's intragenerational conflict, or conflict between members of the same generation. So why should I pay for the damage that other countries have caused? Why should I accept climate refugees from other places? So you can see there are a lot of different things that we need to think about when we start to address the issue of climate change, and it's very difficult to even get a handle on it before jumping into second, third, fourth order impacts, into a tornado-sized funnel of doubt, and then never actually getting anywhere. Perhaps a comforting response to the dilemma of value pluralism and the overwhelm of not knowing where to start is the economist Thomas Sowell's observation that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. There's no perfect answer to this wicked, wicked problem, and the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can start somewhere, knowing that we'll need to change our strategy and refine our scope as we go. And luckily, we have a regulator that has as the insurance sector, we have a regulator that feels the same way. So the Prudential Authority has made it very clear that climate-related risks are high on the agenda, and they've released a number of guidance notes and reports over the last few months trying to help insurers and other financial institutions start on their climate risk journey. And they've been exceptionally collaborative in coming up with their strategy and guidelines because they recognize that this is a big unknown for everyone, and the best chance we have of managing it is if we all work together. So the Prudential Authority hasn't yet said when insurers will need to start reporting on climate change, but they have made it clear that they shouldn't wait for perfect regulation or perfect knowledge to start. They should treat it like any other risk to their assets and liabilities and really just start managing it some way. So I guess the question is where to start. And to answer this, I'd like to draw on some African wisdom. There's a quote often attributed to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which says, "There's only one way to eat an elephant, one bite at a time." So the bite that Bothlale and I have chosen to focus on is looking at the impacts of climate change on the mortality and morbidity of insured lives in South Africa. But before we get into that, and speaking of elephants, I'd like to address the elephant in the room and ask you to indicate by show of hands, what level of risk do you feel climate change poses to the mortality and morbidity risks of life and health insurers in South Africa? So who thinks it's high risk? Okay. Moderate risk? And low risk? Okay. A lot of people think it's other, I'm assuming. But from what I can tell, it seems the consensus in this room and the people I tend to speak to is that, at least not currently, is climate change seen as a big risk in terms of mortality and morbidity impacts for life and health insurers. And this is especially true on the liability side of the balance sheet, which is affected by the physical risks of climate change, like rising sea levels and heat waves, floods, droughts, and so on. There's a bit more buy-in that the asset side of the balance sheet may be affected by transition risk, which is the financial costs of transitioning to a low-carbon economy, but even that seems to be muted. And this is reflected in surveys and studies I've seen around the world. For example, RGA released the results of a survey a few months ago in which they interviewed 17 life and health insurers in South Africa about climate change. 85% of respondents said that they believe climate change poses a low to moderate risk to their business. And this was climate change in general, not just the mortality and morbidity aspect. In the same survey, 55% of respondents said that they're treating climate change with low or no priority when it comes to preparing for the impacts on their business. And I do understand why insurers feel this way. As life and health insurers, at least, we probably haven't seen yet a material impact on our mortality and morbidity experience that can be ascribed to climate change. If it is going to happen, it will probably happen far into the future beyond the typical ORSA time horizon of 3 to 5 years or the 1-year medical scheme pricing cycle. Secondly, there has been research to date that suggests that there won't be a material impact on South Africans' mortality due to climate change. For example, this is an excerpt from a study by Chen et al. From earlier this year. I've just highlighted South Africa in the red rectangle. And what this tells us is that they expect to see a very small number of excess deaths because of climate change. In fact, for cold-related deaths, climate change may actually be a good thing. Then there's the argument that in many cases we can reprice our way out of trouble if we see that there is a material impact on our experience due to climate change, so we don't really need to worry about that. And then lastly, the argument that always wins. There are so many other more urgent, non-climate related fires that we need to put out and are clamoring for our attention and resources. These are all excellent arguments. They form a solid steel man, and they may all very well be true, that I'm not disputing. But there is a 4-letter F word that may come to mind when you start thinking about having to account for climate change and its impacts on your mortality and morbidity experience. It's a problematic word which should never be uttered in professional company. That word is feel. as actuaries and other insurance or risk professionals, we don't deal in feelings, and I say that with the most affection. We deal in data, in science, in evidence, and in facts. So if you believe that climate change will not have a material impact on your mortality and morbidity, you need to do the work that justifies this assumption for your specific and unique set of business circumstances. It's not enough just to feel like there won't be an impact. And then secondly, although some research suggests that there may not be material impacts on our mortality and morbidity, there's a lot of other research which shows that we can actually expect detrimental impacts to our health and well-being, especially on the morbidity side. Again, this risk may or may not be material, but we need to assess a hypothesis, make assumptions about the future, and then be able to evidence the process that led us to make this assumption and these assessments. And this evidence gathering does not need to be the most sophisticated model in the world. Regulators, including the Prudential Authority, really favor a risk-based and pragmatic approach. And in fact, this is an area where a lot of the work can be done for you. And that's where we come in, because Bothlale and I have actually been doing a bit of work to look at what the expected impacts of climate change on mortality and morbidity of insured lives in South Africa are. And Bothlale will now take you through some of our preliminary findings.
Thank you very much, Pam. I'm going to be speaking about the effects of climate change on mortality and morbidity in the South African context. This is based on a few papers from overseas and some of the insight data that we've pulled, preliminary data that we've pulled to see if there is an impact that's currently coming through. So as I was going through this research to speak about this topic, it felt like I was getting PTSD from all the work that I had to put together. And I thought PTSD, actually it's pretty close enough to PSTD, And I look at climate change like Peter Steph to toy, because you don't know when you're going to be impacted, you don't know where you're going to be impacted, and you don't know how hard you're going to be impacted by climate change. So today I'm just going to be giving you a few ideas of some of the areas where climate change may have an impact on mortality and morbidity. So the first thing that I looked at, the first condition that I looked at was heart attacks. So when the human body feels overheated, the brain starts to send signals to the heart to beat faster. This is something that the heart cannot do indefinitely, as the higher requirement for blood flow leads to a higher need for oxygen. And this ends up with the heart being in an oxygen-starved state and puts the person at risk for a heart attack. So based on a global study done in the Lancet from the period of 1990 to 2019, they found that 62% of climate change-related deaths were due to cardiovascular disease. Further in this paper, they said that people who would be most affected is the elderly, those with hypertension, and diabetes. And if we look at our hypertension and diabetes statistics in South Africa, with 11% diabetes prevalence in the adult population and a 33% prevalence of hypertension in South Africa, both of these are indicators that we are very much at risk to be affected, especially in the heart attack space, by climate change. Moving on and looking at our data, so this is 2019 data, taking a look at the average temperature in South Africa on a given day, and the dots show us where we see excess heart attacks taking place. And we can see that the excess dots are actually concentrated on the higher temperatures, and then on the lower temperatures, I do apologize, on the higher points, we also see increase in excess heart attacks in that period. So from a preliminary perspective, we actually do see a bit of a link between average temperature and excess heart attacks taking place. Taking a look at strokes, it's a little bit more clearer. It is a little bit more clearer line in this one, is that we have the advent of heat stroke. And a similar study, also published in The Lancet, found that the countries that would be most burdened by strokes due to higher temperature and lower temperature were countries with low socio-economic index, so regions, and they mentioned such as Africa. And if you take a look at the graphs on the right, you will see that South Africa, from a high temperature perspective, we are medium to high risk, and from a low temperature perspective, we actually sit on the high risk band in terms of risk of stroke due to changes in climate, due to climate change. Taking a look at the actual data, we see a very similar picture to what we saw for heart attacks, with the dots concentrated on the higher temperatures, and then yet again on the lower temperatures, on the higher areas, we see the excess strokes actually taking place. So the next thing that we took a look at was emergency services. The picture that we see on the right, on my right, is a picture of the honorable former Minister of Health, Minister Zweli Mkhize, when they had the motorbike ambulances that they were trying to push through in the Eastern Cape. And the study that I looked at took a look at the impact of heat waves on the number of emergency services, or the increase in the demand for emergency services during heat waves. And this was a study based in Tasmania, Australia. And they found that during a low-intensity heat wave, there was a 4% increase in the demand for ambulance services. In a medium-intensity heat wave, there was a 10% increase in the demand for ambulances. And in a high-intensity heat wave, they found a 34% increase in the requirement for ambulance services, and thus the requirement for emergency services after the fact. So the Honourable Minister may not have been wrong with moving us to a motorbike ambulatory services. He may have been just a man ahead of his time. Looking at the data that we see from a South African context, and this is looking at emergency room consultations, we can see that we have the dots concentrated again in the high areas and in the low areas as well. On the higher points, when we have the lower temperatures, we see that we have excess emergency room consultations. The last condition I looked at from a direct impact perspective is asthma. And as it says, it ain't easy being wheezy. So higher temperatures that come with climate change can also promote more ground-level ozone pollution. And ozone is a very powerful lung entrant which can actually trigger asthma attacks. And as I showed in the previous three conditions, we see a similar trend with the higher points having more excess asthma attacks, and yet again on the low points as well. Looking at the indirect impacts of climate change on mortality and morbidity, what I did was I just pulled a few news articles over the last very long period, 2 months, of extreme weather events that have taken place in South Africa. And you can see that these events are taking place more and more often, and these will actually have impacts in the in the medium to longer run on things like food security, water security, and supply chain. And in the medical scheme context, we import a lot of the medication that we have in South Africa. What would happen if our supply chain is actually affected by extreme weather events? Is it going to increase the cost of healthcare? Is it going to make it harder for healthcare to actually be delivered across the country? And how do schemes deal with it going into the future? So after speaking about all the bad things that could happen, what do we do now? And I went back and I thought of the Speeders Theft, the Detroit example. What would you do to mitigate his impact? You would, take certain precautions to make sure that you minimize the impact that you experience from climate change. And then moving on to where to start, I'm going to hand over back to Pamela.
Thank you. So this has been a crash course in why health and life insurers should care about climate change and the impacts on their mortality and morbidity experience. Not only is it good risk management practice, but we are seeing suggestions that there may actually be detrimental impacts to our mortality and morbidity in South Africa. If you are an insurer or even a corporate wondering where to start on your journey or what to do next, what we'd suggest is starting with building awareness throughout the company. So, undertake training courses for everyone from the board to first line function, so that people can start speaking about and speaking the same language, and so that the board is equipped to make informed decisions when it comes to climate risk management. Then start engaging in dialogue and discussions with stakeholders throughout the business who may be able to contribute to this conversation, so that you can really identify and assess the risks that are going to be pertinent to your specific business. And then once you have that conversation started, you can reflect and think about how you'll manage, mitigate, monitor all these risks, but also identify the opportunities that are going to come with this massive environmental change. Please feel free to reach out to us and discuss further. We'd be happy to guide where we can. We really hope that this does not turn out to be a material risk for any insurer, for any medical scheme, or for South Africans in general, but we need to rely on more than a feeling to prove this. Thank you.